friend reminded me, he was like, hey man, you're never going to be as young as you are today. You need to do the hard one. And I did. And I'm so glad I did, you know?
Welcome to Mindset Lessons from the Field. I'm Gina Casazzo, the author of the upcoming memoir, Training with the SEAL. Today's guest is a retired colonel with over 20 years of veteran experience in the U.S. Army. He's a West Point graduate, Army Aviator, and has spent more than half of his career in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment Airborne. As a Night Stalker, he commanded at every level, from captain to lieutenant colonel, and he deployed to combat numerous times as a mission pilot, maintenance test pilot, air missions commander, and a task force chief of operations. Today, he continues to serve at the intersect of defense and technology as an enterprise operations lead at Palantir Technologies, delivering software advantages and AI solutions to Americans' warfighters worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, I am excited to introduce you to Brandon Parrish. Brandon, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Gina. It's great to see you. This is exciting.
I am really excited. First of all, I know this is your first, podcast. So I want to make it painless for you and fun, I hope. And you are our second person from 160th. So I do have some questions that I didn't get to ask the last person when he talked to me about what the process is like to get there. But I want to start with West Point because West Point was the school I really wanted to go to. It's a hard school to get into. Oh my God. And so for you, did you always know you wanted to go into the military? And what was it like going to West Point?
So I did always know I wanted to go to the military. It's something I wanted to do. And I always knew I wanted to fly since I was about 3 years old. I was that rare kid who just knew. I thought that route for me growing up in Colorado was to go to the Air Force Academy. And so sort of the first major setback, I guess, of my life. I've had a pretty sheltered upbringing, strong family unit growing up and things like that. My first big disappointment was not getting into the Air Force Academy, which I believe now is just providence. I've had such a great experience, going another path. So I got into West Point and Annapolis. I chose West Point, had really great leaders there. But yeah, it's an intense culture shock. There is a very deliberate process by which they sort of break people down and then rebuild them into soldiers. It was hard and I wanted to quit, but my parents encouraged me to stay. I ended up staying and graduated, and the rest is history.
Okay, so I have to ask you this question because you said something really interesting. You said I had a sheltered upbringing, right? And I did too. So I had a great family, and I had hardships and setbacks as a child. I auditioned for something and didn't get it, things like that. And then I would go back and do it. And that resilience was in me because my parents threw me in everything. And when something didn't work, they were like, well, go again and go again and go again, right? So for your first setback, what was that like? Because a lot of times people that grow up sheltered, when they have their first setback, they crumble. They don't have that resiliency. So how did you develop that resiliency?
Maybe sheltered isn't a great choice of words. I've listened to some more of your interviews with people, and there are a lot of people you've interviewed that have overcome, incredible amounts of adversity before they even got to the military, right? That was not my experience.
Yeah.
My parents are still married. They just celebrated 50 years last month. They taught me the value of hard work and of, sticking to things. I remember growing up a quote, and this comes up later in my story, I think. My mom would always say, to whom much is given, much is expected, which is a Bible verse, right? And so that sort of fixed in my mind the idea that there was some potential that I was meant to fulfill. And as corny as that might sound, I knew that, or at least I believed that there was, some mission that I had for my life. And that made it a lot easier for me to not quit when things got hard. So, at West Point, it's a weeding out process. And there are many more of those in my story where, sometimes it seems easier to quit. And it's funny that the Night Stalker creed or the Night Stalker motto is Night Stalkers don't quit. It's like a religion. You do not quit anything ever. And that was my mindset long before I joined the regiment because of how I was raised.
Being at West Point, which you said like they break you down, you wanted to quit a couple of times. Like, can you have a moment that you can recall where you wanted to quit? And then how did you bounce back from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember it vividly. Your first year as a plebe, they call it, your freshman year, you're a plebe. There's a lot of nonsense. There was some hazing back then, light hazing. Nobody ever laid a hand on me, but there were some hazing rituals that you had to go through. And it was just such a shock to I was not a very cosmopolitan, kid growing up on a ranch in Colorado. And then all of a sudden I'm in New York, surrounded by people that are yelling at me constantly. And I remember we used to get like 1 5-minute phone call a week to call home to our families. And I was on a payphone in the basement of one of the barracks talking to my folks. And I was like, look, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to quit. I want to come home. And they just encouraged me. They were like, look, you do what you got to do. But like, if you come home, like, it's not going to be the same. You're not just going to be hanging out here and just go back to normal. Like, things are going to be different. And I was like, I don't remember my reaction. I was upset, but I decided I would stick with it at least until recognition, which is the point at spring break, your plebe year. All of a sudden, all the hazing stops. You start being called by your first name and treated like a normal person. And I was like, I'll hang out till recognition, and then we'll see how it goes. And by that time, I was having a pretty good time, and I was enjoying myself, and I was good at it. And so I was like, yeah, I'll give it another year. We'll see what happens. And I just kept giving it another year until I graduated.
Yeah. Yeah, that got to be really hard. I know for like myself, like I already get down on myself sometimes, like especially, you know, I'm sure we're going to talk about this for yourself, but like when you transition out of the military, like the military pretty much, it has a clear path. I'm like, you have to go to this, you have to do this, you have to go to this school, you have to pass this, and you're going to get here, here, and here. And it's like in
Exactly.
life, it's not like that when you're like an entrepreneur or when you transition and it's like, what's next, right? How do you handle like someone yelling at you all the time, constantly, and then not getting down on yourself or not beating yourself up? Or maybe you did.
That's a good question. And it's interesting that you point out that there's no clear path, because now that I'm on the other side, fairly recently, like, that's one challenge. There's no clear next step, and there always was leading up to now. But to your question, I guess you have to realize, and I think I realized early on, that it's a game. These are roles people are playing in almost every like military training situation. The guy yelling at you is probably not a bad guy. He's probably just playing a role to try to develop you in some way. And my first year was not easy. I didn't figure this. I wasn't like a stellar cadet. I wasn't the kid that figured this out on day one and just cruised through. But you keep your mouth shut. You take it, and then you kind of just realize that they're playing a role. And I went on to play the same role to my eternal shame.
Mm.
I tried to be a yeller for like my first day in a leadership position as a sophomore, and it went poorly. I made my plebe cry, and I don't think I ever really yelled at him again. That was not my style. I just learned you got to be yourself.
So what was then next? Like after West Point, what was the next step?
I knew I wanted to be an aviator. I was lucky to branch aviation my senior year, where you select what branch you go to in the military based on your class rank. I was lucky enough to get a slot in aviation, despite being way too tall to be a helicopter pilot, which is another story. A wink and a smile got me through that first flight physical. I moved down to Fort Rucker, Alabama, which is where Rotary Wing Flight School is for the Army. Because I was so tall, I got to take a non-traditional path through flight school. I got to fly the UH-1 Huey, which is the old Vietnam warbird, where almost all of my classmates ended up flying a different aircraft. And the Huey it's like the Harley Davidson of helicopters. It was really, really fun. I graduated flight school after a little over a year, probably 15 months, down at Fort Rucker, now Fort Novosel. They've changed the name. I PCS to Germany. I was in the first class to graduate flight school after 9/11. I joined a peacetime army. 10 days after 9/11, I pinned on my wings and started packing up to move. So my experience was very different than what I expected. I lived in Heidelberg, Germany, which is my favorite city in the world now. It's a college town. There's a huge, like, ancient castle there.
Wow.
I lived right across the river, with the view of the old city and the castle. And I was really enjoying my life. We were flying VIPs around Europe. I selected Blackhawks, the UH-60 in flight school. So I'm a Black Hawk pilot in Germany. Meanwhile, all of my friends and classmates had gone to these combat aviation brigades elsewhere in the Army, all of whom were laser focused on Afghanistan. And then within a year or two, they became focused on Iraq. I'm in this non-deployable VIP unit in Germany, and I'm getting emails from friends and family back home who don't really understand the military. All my friends are deploying, going into combat, getting their patches and everything. And I'm drinking beer on a riverside and getting these emails saying, hey, I hope the sandstorms aren't too bad and hope you're staying safe over there. I was enjoying myself, but there's a little bit of shame involved in that. I remember hearing about the 160th as a cadet a couple of times. I had an instructor. Every now and then the instructors would just take a day off and tell you war stories. And I had an instructor that had done some training with the regiment, and he just spoke of these guys with such reverence and was talking about their skill. And that sort of planted a seed. Another memory is Army-Navy week. Army-Navy is a huge deal. It's like the most important college football game, arguably, every year. And so there's a big ramp up, a big celebration in the week leading up to it. One time they did this corny skit. We were out on the football field. There's this corny skit where the Army mascot is a guy in a mule suit, gets, captured by bad guys and put inside this cage. West Point sits up on a cliff over the Hudson River. Before you knew it, we didn't know this was coming. And then all of a sudden, almost instantly, there's a blacked out Chinook hovering over the field. Guys are roping out of it. They cut the cage that this mascot was in, and they stabo him out. Like they hooked him to a line and then just flew away. And the Chinook is a massive aircraft. You can see it. You can see it here in my background. Like it's huge. It's the size of a school bus. It's really loud. But they had come, I assume, below the cliff line, so the noise didn't really carry. And then they just popped over the field. And there were Rangers all around with dune buggies, and they're firing blanks out of their machine guns and all this stuff. And I think that was the moment. I was like, that's what I'm going to do. Like I knew that was my thing, my adventure. And as corny as it sounds, if that was a recruiting effort, boy, it worked.
Yeah.
Fast forward back to Germany. I got this shame. The war had started. I volunteered to go with my current unit when OIF started. We invaded Iraq. We self-deployed. I took a platoon of guys and we were attached to another unit. 2-1 Aviation was the unit. And we were supposed to go through Turkey into northern Iraq for the initial invasion. Because we self-deployed, we stopped in Camp Bonsteel, Kosovo, and we were waiting for Turkey to open up their airspace and allow us to go through there, which never happened. So we ended up just sitting around in Kosovo for a month after the invasion. And then we turned around and went home. We got orders to return to Germany. And I said, this is not my calling. Like, this is not what I want to do. I decided that if in a couple of years I wasn't in the 160th, I would probably get out of the Army. So the day I made captain, I mailed off my application. And a couple months later, I heard back. They're like, your packet review went well, and we would like you to come to Fort Campbell for an assessment. And so that was the next step.
Did you feel that going to West Point prepared you for what you face at 160th? And I only say that because our 160th guest on the show mentioned they're screaming in your face constantly. It's a very, very stressful environment. And you just told me at West Point, that's what they were doing the first year. So what was your experience? And did that prepare you? And also, did you know that going into it? Did you know it was going to be like that?
I saw that interview, and I have to give you the caveat that the officer experience is much different than the enlisted experience. In Green Platoon. A lot of the enlisted soldiers, not a lot, but there are a number of them that are direct assigned from Department of the Army. So they don't necessarily volunteer. Some of them do, but not all of them do. Some of them are just assigned to the 160th. The weeding out process for them is enlisted Green Platoon. The weeding out process for the officer side is the assessment. We do a week of TDY at Fort Campbell. Can't say too much about the assessment, but you are tested thoroughly, physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically. They put you through the ringer a little bit.
How long is it, the testing?
The assessment is 1 week, and it also includes, there's a flying portion to make sure you know what you're doing in the aircraft and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that's our weeding out process. So once we get to Green Platoon, it's a much more fun environment than what the enlisted guys go through, because they are being weeded out during enlisted Green Platoon. Later in my career, I got to be involved in what they call Black Day, which is, it's the
he mentioned
PTO
that.
day.
Yeah, he mentioned that day. For that week that you were there, that week where you're like, I have to get through this week. Was there ever a moment where you were like, I don't know if I could keep doing this?
There were moments where I was sure I was going to fail. And you know, like everyone knows going in that you can't quit. Like Night Stalkers don't quit, right? Like if you quit anything, you don't have a chance of ever serving in that unit again. And so I knew I had to at least get to the end. There were a lot of moments where I was like, yeah, I'm not going to pass this check ride. You know, I don't think I could do any more pull-ups than this, you know, things like that. It's a well-run assessment course where they really get to the heart of like who you are as a person. You know, does this person have grit? How do they react, you know, under pressure? How do they react when faced with failure? There's a lot of, you know, I can't tell you a ton of detail about it, but they are very effective at weeding out people who maybe want to come for the wrong reasons or who won't perform once they get to the unit. And somehow I slipped through the cracks and made it.
For yourself, like after you made it through. Let's talk about now like this moment of like, you know, this part of your career, because this is half of your career, right?
Sure.
Is 160th. What was it like for you in the very beginning versus like where you ended up? Because, and for those that didn't hear the Night Stalker interview that we had prior, you know, with the other guest on the show, John Hamilton, it's a very stressful environment. Like and there's a lot of different factors that can just happen. So was there ever, especially in the beginning, like a shocking moment for you or a shocking lesson that you had to experience in the 160th?
I don't recall ever being shocked because the training is so valuable. Green Platoon for me lasted about a year. You know, you do a combat skills phase, which is pretty similar to the combat skills the enlisted Green Platoon goes through. But then you go into aircraft qualifications and you train in every environment. You know, we did desert mountain training. We did aerial refueling, which no one else in the Army can do. They're not equipped for it. We did, you know, deck landings and over water stuff. And the training was to the level that you're sort of mentally prepared for almost anything that can come up. Like the goal is to spit out Green Platoon graduates that can deploy the next day and be productive members of the team and fly those missions. And I think they were pretty successful. I don't think there were any real shocks. Like you always wonder if you have what it takes, even though you're trained, like your first combat mission is still hair raising, you know, but I don't remember ever being shocked or feeling unprepared outside that first mission. Like after that, you kind of just fall into a groove and you do it so much. Like we're hitting targets every night, sometimes multiple targets every night. And it just becomes, it sounds absurd to say this, but it becomes routine. We were doing like absurdly complicated and dangerous things every single night. And it just became routine.
I'm going to segue then to later. And, you know, as you know, Air Mission Commander, you know, Task Force Chief. And I want to talk about then, it's different when it's you, right? When it's like your self-doubt or your fears or anything like that. But then when you have to focus on the team, I mean, their lives are, you know, in your hands essentially, right? Where like you feel responsible for them. How do you mentally like, and I get it, like you're trained, right? And like we're in these situations, but also there is a huge responsibility of these lives are in my hands. We're doing these dangerous things. How do you cope with that level of responsibility?
First of all, it was never just me. The structure of the teams was such that, you know, the flight lead, who's almost always a warrant officer, those guys took a great amount of that pressure on themselves, and they're really the expert. Officers tend to pass through the regiment, while warrant officers a lot of times stay there forever for their entire career. And so those guys are such a fountain of knowledge and experience that they took on a great deal of that burden to share with the Air Mission Commanders. Everybody there, but especially those flight leads that were mentors to me, were such high caliber dudes that made it quite a bit easier. The personal danger, at least in my case, you kind of just deal with that ahead of time. I didn't think too much about that when I was in, you know, the situations where the danger would come up. You kind of deal with it ahead of time. You're like, I volunteered for this. I asked to be here. You know, whatever happens, happens. And then you just focus on the mission. And you know, not to be trite, but there's a saying that goes, you don't rise to the level of your, how does it go? You don't rise to the level of your potential, you fall to the level of your training. The training was so good and our SOPs were so robust and our adherence to those SOPs was so complete that everyone internalized them. It just comes natural. We don't go out the door without like contingency plans 3 levels deep.
Mm-hmm.
And so like everybody kind of knew. We do good rehearsals. We talk about everything that's going to happen ahead of time. Your question is, how did I personally deal with it? You trust the guys who are there with you. Like these are the most qualified aviators in the Army, and the ground forces we support are the most qualified, deadliest people in the world. If something goes wrong, we're coming for them or they're coming for us. You know that going in.
Did the mindset at all shift for you when you became a husband and a father?
Oh, absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. 100% it shifted.
let's talk about that. Like how did that shift for you?
Yeah. So I met my wife around the same time that I got to Green Platoon. She's a strong, independent woman. Like I didn't worry about her too much. I knew she would be fine. She's a professional. I knew she would be fine if anything happened to me. We waited a few years to have kids. Once we had kids, that's when things sort of changed. That's when it stopped being quite as fun. I think I deployed twice after my oldest was born. One of those was a flying rotation. The other one, I think I was the S3 or Chief of Operations for the task force, which is significantly less, physical danger. That also happened to align with the time in my career where in the 160th, I was kind of running out of jobs to do as a major. I'd already done the ones I needed to do to get promoted. And there was another goal I had in mind in my career that I was running out of time to go accomplish. So it just worked out. I didn't have to deploy much after I had kids. And shortly after that, I left to go to grad school and then teach at West Point. I was very lucky. There are other guys who spend, their whole lives in the regiment, their whole careers in the regiment with kids, with families. I know guys whose kids went all the way through school and graduated while they were, line pilots deploying 2, 3, 4 times a year, especially during the GWAT. I mean, their families sacrificed so much. It's really amazing. I would love to introduce you to some of them so you can talk to them about it,
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a different ball game when it's just you, right? And then it's a totally different ball game when you're married or when you have kids. That's, because they're so young, and it's, that is mentally draining, and that's mentally tough, and you have to push them aside for a bit while you make it home. You get that mission done to make it home. So, and I want to talk about, like, we talked about how Night Stalkers, they're constantly facing threats. Environment also, there are some times where there's environment, weather, like natural, things that occur that are out of your control, right? How do you develop an adaptability to face unpredictable challenges? And do you have a story that you could share where you had to face that unpredictable challenge?
I probably have a couple, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it all falls back to contingency plans and knowing that you're surrounded by the best in the world. The enemy always gets a vote, right? Another cliche that we use. There are also other unpredictable things, like a really small one I remember from one of my very first rotations. We're under immense pressure to get to the target on time. That's part of the creed. Plus, we can hit any target anywhere, arriving time on target plus or minus 30 seconds. That's the Night Stalker guarantee, right? And that was a different standard than the rest of the Army.
Yeah, that's better than Amazon today.
Exactly. Yeah. And because of that, any little thing can throw you off your timeline. I remember one night the flight lead, had a problem with his mic, or, there's something in his helmet, like some connection wasn't working right. And a little thing like that can make you late to the target. And hitting the target on time, no matter the circumstance, no matter the enemy situation or the weather, is part of our religion as Night Stalkers. And a little thing like that could disrupt the whole mission. And so, but fortunately, we're surrounded by the best in the world. So like our ALSI guy, our life support equipment guy, just ran up there, fixed something really quick, and off we took. I don't feel like I'm answering your question in a really great way. How do we deal with it?
It's funny that you say this because I'm starting a new company and we're launching technically we're launching like end of November, but like it's official, like a soft launch, and then the main launch. And I'm working with my brother, who is the type of person that does not take no for an answer, right? Where like if they tell us they can't ship it at this price, my brother's like, we ship it at that, like we can figure it out, right? And he's like, if they're telling us they can't use the fabric to make it ground. He's like, no, they can use the fabric. Like, he's that type of guy. And it's funny that you say that, because I couldn't even imagine like being able to, that's just one person, right? Where most people in life are just like, oh, okay, we can't use that fabric. Okay, like no problem. And he's just like, no, and it's interesting because you're surrounded by all those guys. Like, it's like you make it happen. Like, it's just like 30 seconds. We're going to do it. I need to know, I'm going to be jumping the gun a minute, because this is, I think, really important for the civilians listening to the show. How does being surrounded by guys like that translate to then civilian life and the people that now you work with on an everyday basis?
We used to laugh that we are all just different versions of the same guy. I don't mean to be so gender specific. When I was flying there, it was all of the pilots were men. Now they have female Night Stalker pilots who are doing great. They have female Night Stalker commanders. But forgive me for using the term guys. But yeah, it's a learning curve. Like, now that there are two big shifts between being a Night Stalker and being an Army guy and then being a civilian. The one is I no longer have rank, and the other one is I can't use the same vocabulary and intonation that I would as a Night Stalker. These are all guys who are just like me, so you can talk to them like this, give them the knife hand. This is what's going to happen. I need you to do this, and they'll go do it. And they talk to me too. It's a fairly flat culture where, like, experience trumps rank most of the time. So if a CW5 says, "Hey sir, I need you to go do this," I'm like, "Roger that. I'm going to do it." Now I have to lead with influence rather than authority. I'm in a unique position because you mentioned that I work for Palantir, which is, in my opinion, it's a special company because it's full of Palantir is equally good at screening for talent. I've made a wildly successful career for myself, both in and out of the military, out of being the dumbest guy in every room. Palantir is just like the regiment in that, it's the same level of talent. It's the same type of people everyone is running as fast as the one next to them. I can't knife hand people. I have to be, much softer and gentler in my language. And sometimes I fail at that. I don't want to perpetuate any stereotypes about veterans, but that was a shift. I think I've made that shift successfully. But I'm also lucky to be surrounded by a similar level of talent as I was in my prior life. Does that get to the answer?
Definitely. Yeah, it reminds me, as you're saying this, it reminds me of Sean Murphy on the show, Navy SEAL, and he had this story of when his daughter was being born, and it was just an insane story, where he didn't know if his wife and daughter were going to make it and what was happening, and they kind of like kept him in a room for a really long time. He's pacing, hours go by, he doesn't know what's happening, right? And he's like, and the SEAL just came out, and he's like, and I just looked at the nurse and was like, you, come here. He goes, sometimes you're so focused, and also, he was also like you in terms of X amount of years, and, it's definitely a big, different transition. And, you seem to be rather lucky that you're in a position and you're with an organization or company that has high level people. How do you deal with people that are more complacent? Like, how do you deal with people that maybe don't take responsibility, that, don't work well as a team, that will just settle? Essentially, I feel like we live in a world of just settlers, right? So what do I think also the thing is, like, we've become lazy because life is so easy. Like, everything is at our fingertips, right? Amazon today, we need to figure something out. We now have Chat GPT. We have these AI softwares to help with the editing. Things are so easy where we just like don't want to go the extra mile. And for you, like, coming from where you've come from, there is no room for error. There is no laziness, so how do you deal with that in civilian life?
I'm afraid this will be unsatisfying, but I don't. I don't have anyone like that, especially at work. Like, there's no one who is not pulling their weight. And I think that's a really rare and unusual thing. I was really lucky to find this role in this company because of that. And in other areas of my life, the stakes are low. I have to remind myself often that the stakes are low. No one's shooting at me anymore. Like I don't need to get worked up about this. I don't need to go yell at anyone. I can imagine, the story you told about the SEAL whose wife's and baby's life were in danger. Like the stakes are very high, and I probably would have done the same thing. I probably would have, some old habits would have come out in me. Now it's much more like I can avoid people who aren't pulling their weight because I don't have to work with them. Everyone at work is, super high talent and high drive and high grit. And in other areas of my life, I just avoid that sort of thing because it brings out qualities in me that I don't really like. They're not really appropriate for this phase of my life,
So let me ask you this question, because I do this thing with myself where I assess me, especially when I'm with my family, because they bring out the worst in you because they know you so well and you know them so well. It's just, I always find it the best training. Okay. And that's how I look at it. So me and my family, we live like 3,000 miles away from each other, but we see each other quite frequently. My family thinks I live next door, where they're like, come over tomorrow. And I'm just like, okay. And then I'm on a plane and I'm seeing them, and it's just kind of nuts. But I love it because when I leave with them, I always assess, okay, like I got very defensive when they criticized me, right? Do I get defensive with other people? My family likes to say when I speak, sometimes I come off very intense, right? And then it becomes cognizant for me, like in the real world without them, right? And I can be more aware of it and then go back to training. I mean, that's all training, right? And then go back to them to put it to the test and be like, okay, like if they don't say anything about my abruptness, like, then when we finish, I'm like, how was them? Like I reassess everything. So for yourself, what were the old habits for you that you then transitioned out of, and how do you do that? Like, how do you get rid of those old habits?
I'm not sure that I have been 100% successful in this, but I
Neither have
do
I.
get really, I'm a bit like you, I suspect. Like I'm probably more candid for most people's comfort. I tend to be more direct. My wife is a good foil for me. She'll say to me, maybe you could have said that a little nicer, or maybe so-and-so might have taken that in a certain way that you didn't intend. So I do a lot of apologizing for that kind of thing. And I honestly don't know how much of that is because of my background, that how much of that was I conditioned to, and how much of that is just my personality. Going into the Army, I was a pretty laid back, happy-go-lucky guy in my memory, and now I'm pretty serious, driven, sort of direct person. And I don't know how much of that is just being a veteran, and how much of it's being a soft guy, how much of it is just being a curmudgeon. I don't know. So how do I deal with it? I do a lot of apologizing. I have to be consciously soft, like much more soft than I would otherwise, because of these gentle reminders from my family. And sometimes I just like, when the stress is high, when the pressure's on, all that kind of just falls by the wayside. I don't yell much anymore, I hope, but I do get pretty directive. When things need to get done, I do have a tendency to be very directive. Fortunately, like companies need that. I thought coming out of the military that I had no skills other than flying helicopters. I retired in a hurry because of a medical condition that stopped me from being able to fly anymore. I had to choose a new career, very fast. I ended up in defense tech, and I realized that tech companies need people like me who can make sure things get done and on time and hold people accountable to, milestones and things like that. So it's not all bad. Maybe I'm not everyone's favorite person at a party all the time, but I know how to get things done. And most of the guys like me from the regiment have the same skill set.
Then let's talk about how you guys develop that skill set. Like, what are the lessons that you've learned that helped you to get that job that you got, right? And that helped you to make that transition a bit easier.
We talked about SOPs, standard operating procedures, systems and processes. There's a level of productivity that you can't achieve without a certain amount of process, especially in tech and software. Like a lot of software engineers are artists. They don't always appreciate process, but I think they see the value in it. And so, somebody like me, the 160th runs on SOPs. It's not strict adherence to them that matters. It's knowing the intent and being able to execute and branch off of that when the situation arises, right? And I think that's been really valuable. A lot of what I do, especially early on, I joined my current team, in its pilot stage. where they were still building out process. And that's explicitly my job, is to build out process and, help them deal with bureaucracy so that they can just focus on being artists and writing code and doing cool stuff with software. And it just kind of comes naturally after years of doing that in the regiment. I would always tell guys, younger guys that came after me, I'd always say, like, hey, work yourself out of a job, which really means put enough thought and effort into the systems up front that you can take leave once in a while and the company doesn't fall apart, and the aircraft don't die. I kind of do the same thing here. I try to just, I try to set up systems that are self-serve that people can follow with or without me, with or without my, physical help. And it seems to be valued.
Another thing I wanted to ask, which I probably should have asked earlier, but we mentioned high stressful situations, the job that you have, the lives that are on the line, all that stuff. So what I want to know is, were there in trainings like techniques that they taught you to stay focused and stay calm so that translate to anybody, like any one of us that's listening to the show can use or in their daily life?
My mind goes to like breathing exercises and stuff like that. I don't recall ever learning any of that stuff in the regiment. Mostly it was about rehearsals. We would do all kinds of rehearsals. You're constantly training. If you're not deployed, you're training. You're flying, and we trained as we fought, right? We did aerial refueling stateside much more than we did in combat. You're constantly on the road. We had to stay current in every environment. We had to stay current on ships. We had to stay current in the dunker, which is a simulator that turns you upside down and dips you into the pool in a mock aircraft cockpit. We had to stay current in, all these different mission modes, all this different mission equipment that nobody else had. It's repetition and then rehearsals for missions. We would fly rehearsals. We would do, sort of chair rehearsals. Our mission briefs were a form of rehearsal. They were so thorough that everybody knew what they would do at every phase of the mission. So that's kind of how we stayed calm. Like I said, you fall to the level of your training. And the training that we did was so robust and the rehearsals were so thorough and so frequent that when things went wrong, everybody knew what to do. And things did go wrong sometimes. We had
That's
some
what I
bad...
wanted to ask you. I want you to tell me when something went wrong, like, and how you because I want to also point out to people like listening to the show is like, and my family says this to me all the time. When I went to the civilian SEER program, they were like, it's fake kidnapping. Like you're safe, right? Compared to like a real one. And my butt felt so real. I was like, it was like, it didn't feel, and yeah, we had like a word that we can opt out, to stop the game essentially. But you put that in the back of your mind. Like you didn't want to think about that because you wanted this to be like a real thing. And it really felt that way. Tell us about a training that went wrong and that what you were feeling and what was going on in your mind and how you recover from something like that. So that way, when it is the actual real thing, it's like you don't think about the failure that happened. You get through it. Does that make sense?
Like typically the training exercises always go right, but there are injects. The trainers a lot of times would give you unexpected contingencies. So we're flying our, the students do all the planning, they do the brief, they do all the rehearsals. We're out flying, and then all of a sudden we call it the white cell, the people who are like crafting the exercise. We'll put an inject in there. They'll be like, hey, we got a call for you to go do a CASEVAC, emergency CASEVAC at this grid. We would have to figure out how much fuel do we need? How much weight tolerance do we have? How much power will a helicopter have at that altitude? Can we do it? So there's a lot of math, and there's always an inject. There's always some contingency because that's real life. You get so used to things going wrong that you expect it, and it becomes routine. There are a handful of stories of things going wrong in real life then that we're able to handle quickly and professionally because we had done that level of training. I'd like to tell a story. I'm trying to think of one that won't be super upsetting. One in which no one died. I was a maintenance company commander for a while, but I still got to deploy as a line pilot with the flight companies during that time. I was on a rotator, a C-17 with a bunch of my maintenance guys and a fresh helicopter. We rotate our helicopters in and out of combat pretty frequently to take them home to do major maintenance on. We get to an outpost in Afghanistan, and my good buddy Mike was the officer in charge, the air mission commander, who I was going to replace. And Mike was going to stay a couple days, get on the next flight home. A mission pops like an hour after we land. We're all groggy. We hadn't shook out our equipment yet. I decided I could have gone on the mission just in the jump seat as an extra body, but because I didn't even have ammo in my magazines yet, I was like, Mike, I'm going to sit this one out. I'll monitor the Predator feed. I'll be up on the radios. I'm going to sit this one out and not go and, make sure my guys get bedded down and everything. They take off on the mission. I'm watching the feed. We have an overhead video feed in the command center. And it was just me and a junior enlisted comm guy, like the radio guy. He was like a sergeant. We were the only ones there. I'm listening to the radios. I see the landing zone is on the TV. I see a giant cloud of dust and a Chinook comes in. It was the Chinook Mike was flying that I would have been in. And then you expect the dust to clear and it to be an empty LZ with a bunch of Rangers running out towards the target, or a bunch of commandos running towards the target building. When the dust clears, I see a Chinook laying on its side in the LZ. Something went horribly wrong on that landing. Thank goodness I was in the command post, because there would have been nobody else to manage the recovery. This poor sergeant would have been trying to do it by himself with help from a headquarters hundreds of miles away. Long story short, things go wrong in combat. But we're trained for this kind of thing. We were able to coordinate a recovery. We called in some teammates to get the injured guys and distribute them to combat support hospitals in theater. They went to a bunch of different ones, and I was there to sort of keep track and make sure we knew where everyone was. The worst injury ended up being a TBI. The medic had a head injury. The ground force crawled out of the wreckage and still hit the target. And, the rest of the pilots and everybody were fine and came back. So I was able to sort of contribute to the combat scenario, but I'm also really proud to say that we fixed that aircraft. My maintenance company was able to fix that aircraft, and it was flyable. At my change of command ceremony, it was the backdrop when I handed the guide on to my friend Mike, who had been flying the aircraft. So it was kind of a cool, resolution to the story.
It sounds to me, and I could be wrong, but that you really have to be laser focused.
Yeah.
You're seeing something and it's like, you're seeing something go wrong, and you have to be like laser focused for getting through, getting everyone home safe, essentially, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
what I want to know is, for someone like me who overthinks so much, always overthinking, how does one train, or how do they train you to be focused and not overthink and not think about everything else, but just, focus on this one specific thing?
There is certainly a lot of compartmentalization that has to happen in aviation in general, right? You can't be distracted when you're flying an aircraft. You can't just pull over to the side of the road if something goes wrong, right? You've got to be laser focused. You've got to hear every noise and smell every weird smell and evaluate them. So I don't know that it's a trained skill. It's just that the situation becomes so consuming. It takes up so much space in your brain that you just kind of have to set everything else aside, or you're in a lot of risk of, an accident or something because of distraction. And it kind of goes back to your earlier question about how did I handle the responsibility? Like, that responsibility becomes so heavy that you really can't think about anything else when it's happening. I want to say something like enlightening to the listeners that they can generalize to their own lives. And I'm not sure I'm getting there.
The thing is that essentially it's just, you have to be focused, right? And like, for me, as you're saying this too, I'm just thinking, I'm like, I wonder if he's a really good meditator, because it could just you just put things in the back of your mind and just like focus on that one. Like, I do this meditation in the morning, and I'm supposed to like close my eyes, look here, and picture the color green. I mean, it's an 11-minute meditation. Total, I must think of the color green 30 seconds in total, okay? And that's not a full run. It's like 1 second of green, and then my mind's gone, and then, another second of green, and then I come to my actual life and take this meditation out of the four walls. And you could only imagine, if I can barely do it in the four walls, what it's like in the real world, right? Especially when I'm running like a podcast, speakings, and a children's author, and then a new company. It's
Starting
like,
every company, yeah.
like, what? And everyone's like compartmentalized, and I'm just like, compartmentalized. I'm like, and I guess in a way, sometimes I'm just like, I'm always constantly like if I'm doing podcast, I'm like, podcast. Like, before this, I was editing a podcast. And I'm like, every once in a while, I just like wonder, or I'm like, oh, that email. And I'm like, email. And then I have to like constantly like be like, stop with the email. Like, just, we got 1 hour, like 1 hour. And so that's why I'm always like, as you're talking about what you have to do and what you do to like get things done, and then your transition to civilian life, and then the new career that you have, and also as a family man, it's just, I admire the whole compartmentalize.
I'm not sure that I'm as good at it in my normal life as I am
Yeah.
at flying. I'm a horrible meditator.
Mhm.
I aspire to, pursue mindfulness and things like that. I'm not great at it. I'm constantly context shifting throughout the day at work. Yeah, so I'm not great at it. But
Is it
you hear
hard for
people
you
talk about,
then? Like, is it hard for you to go from what you were so good at? I'm not saying you're not good now, but like what you were so good at and what your job was for 20 something years, right? To
Mhm.
then the civilian world where like you just said, like, I don't know how great I am at it these days, like, and like, does that frustrate you? How do you mentally um deal with it essentially?
I have to get used to things not being perfect, not always being done on time.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a challenge. The short answer is, yeah, it's definitely difficult. There are some ways in which I have to lower my standards, right? And that's kind of a dangerous trap to fall into when you're at a place like the 160th. You're surrounded by people who are performing at such a high level all the time. It causes your expectations of people to be maybe unreasonably high, and that's one thing that I notice. Like, sometimes I just have such high expectations of people that I'm always disappointed. I try really hard not to let that bleed over into my family life, and I think
Hmm.
I've succeeded there. But at work, somebody misses a deadline, like, I blow that out of proportion in my mind, and I'm like, "Oh, I can't believe it, like, this is so easy to do, like, just do it on time." But I really, I have to tell myself, people are human, people have other things going on.
Do you feel like it's more like self-talk, or are you to calm yourself down to not get into that reaction mode? Because I am like, I feel the same way. I'm just like, especially when someone's like, they say they're gonna do something, and they don't
Yeah,
follow through on it, or like they don't show up on time. I'm just like, I just can't relate to those kind of people. And
same.
what, you missed a deadline? Like, I don't and you didn't even bother to share with me like, hey, you're going to be a little bit late. So I have to constantly like breathe and like walk away for a hot second before I can then come at it like, so tell me like what
Yeah.
made you miss this? So what do you do for yourself to not be a reactor and to not lead things into your family life, or to not react to people at work and then create that environment where people are just scared of you?
It's funny that you say scared of me. I've been told I'm an intimidating presence because I'm kinda a resting dude face, and I'm an enormous, human. I'm 6'7". So I try really hard not to be intimidating, but I think I am just naturally. But I also, like, I have to consciously take a beat when something like that happens.
Mhm.
Most of my interaction with my team is remote, so that really facilitates me being able to, like, think about a response. But when I'm in person, I just have to remember, like, calm, take a beat, like, think about, assume that they have noble intentions, and they always do. These are Brandon problems. These aren't, other people problems. But it's in the military, especially when all of your interactions are face to face, there were a lot of times where I would just, knife hand somebody, and there are a lot of relationships that I'm lucky to still have because I think my approach was probably too direct most of the time.
Yeah. So, what lessons did you learn in your time as a soft guy help you with everyday challenges, and what do you think are something that we can also take with us to, get through our own challenges in our everyday life?
I think there are probably 2 lessons that I took that I also try to, like, impart to my kids. The first one is discipline. Being disciplined in your daily life, it has compounding returns, right? In a work situation, having good discipline gives you freedom of maneuver. It earns people's trust. It gives you, you get less scrutiny. You have more freedom to to operate how you want to operate if you're disciplined. And also, there are life benefits, health benefits from being disciplined. So that's the first one. The second thing is just like when given a choice between two options, choose the hard option. Every good thing in my life is because of either providence or making a hard decision, making that decision to go to West Point, deciding to, apply to the 160th. Even in my professional life now, I had a couple of options for places to work after the military. And a friend reminded me, he was like, hey man, you're never going to be as young as you are today. You need to do the hard one. And I did. And I'm so glad I did. I have my family because I made hard decisions, and also the happiest times in my life were in pursuit of a summit, some hard mountain to climb, literally or figuratively, choosing the hard thing and being okay with discomfort changed the course of my life in a positive way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show and for talking with us. I thought you were fantastic. And I hope it wasn't too painful for you.
No, it was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for having me. This is really exciting.
Of course. Yeah, you were great. And for everyone that's listening, please like, share, comment, subscribe, become a Substack member so you get access to the book and some other extra goodies. It's completely free to subscribe. And I will see you guys next week. Thank you.